Hey, as I said, I live in Southwest Missouri. I live in the Joplin area, and actually live in a little town called Webb City. And Webb City is a town that takes its high school football really very seriously. Any of you come from high schools that take your high school football maybe just a little bit too seriously? Yeah. So that's Webb City. We take our football real seriously. Won several state championships in a row, and it's a scene. So a few years ago, we had students from a neighboring town show up for the football game on Friday night at our stadium, and they showed up wearing they were wearing bathrobes. Some of them had sheets kind of draped around them, and they were trying to look like Old Testament characters. So they showed up dressed like Old Testament characters, many of them carrying horns and instruments. It was weird. During the first half of the game, these students proceeded to slowly and methodically march around our stadium. The entire first half, that's all they're doing. They're marching silently around our stadium 7 times. Now, some of you Bible scholars in here know what's going on. 7 times. At halftime, they'd finally circumvented our stadium 7 times. At halftime, they stop. They get their trumpets out. They start blowing their trumpets and screaming with all their might. They got killed that day. It didn't go well for them. There's something, though. There's something about showing up in your opponent's stadium, though, right? Especially if you win on your enemy's home turf. My family, we're all big-time Cubs fans. I make no apologies for that. That's all right. I breathe in your hatred. It matters not to me. My son especially, my son is in 9th grade. My son is just over the top, just huge Cubs fan. A few years ago, had the chance to go with a few of my students to St. Louis. We went to Busch Stadium, and we watched a Cubs-Cardinals game. Now, it's me and my son wearing our blue Cubs hats, surrounded by all these Cardinals fans, and the game is not going well for the good guys, that is the Cubs. The game's not going well. We're losing. Gradually, we chip away at the lead, though. In the 9th inning, we come back, and we win the game in the 9th inning. And it was amazing, because here you have 2 happy blue hats in the midst of a sea of upset, disappointed, bummed out red hats, and it couldn't have been more delicious. There's just something, listen, there's just something about showing up on your enemy's home turf and actually winning. Nothing can beat it. Nothing can match it. And that's actually what happens in the story of Elijah over and over again, especially in the text we're going to talk about today. Elijah shows up in enemy territory and watches not Elijah win, but watches God win over and over and over again. In 1 Kings 17, and you've learned a little bit about this already, Israel had given in to worshiping a false god. That false god's name was Baal. See, Israel made a choice. They made a choice that God wasn't quite enough for them, and so they went wandering off after false gods. That's how false gods always enter in our lives, by the way. When we decide, I'm not quite sure that God is enough, so we go looking for something else. And so they started to worship Baal, who, among other things, Baal was the god of the storm. He was the god of rain. And so Elijah says, to show you that Baal is nothing, and to show you that the God of Israel is the true God, there's going to be a drought in the land. And this is going to be a serious drought, just to show you how powerless Baal was. And that's indeed what happens. You have this major drought that happens, and we find Elijah in 1 Kings 17 hanging out by himself in a place called Karith Ravine. Say Karith Ravine. Geography is really important in the story of Elijah. Geography and place names, they always matter. Karith Ravine, this was a place that was on the other side of the Jordan River, which meant that it was outside of Israel. As a matter of fact, the word Karith means to be cut off. That's what Karith means. So here you have the prophet of God literally outside of the promised land, outside of Israel, cut off from Israel in Kerith Ravine, and he's being fed by ravens. I don't know how much you know about ravens, but ravens are dirty birds. They're carrion birds, okay? And so you have the prophet of God outside of Israel being fed by ravens, demonstrating the power of God to cause this drought, but also demonstrating the power of God to provide for his prophet, but to provide for him in kind of unusual, unforeseen ways. You with me so far? Now the next story, the next episode in the story has Elijah going to a different place where God continues to provide for him. I'm going to pick up and read the text at that point. It says, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, said, go at once to a city called Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So just like Kerith Ravine, here's what you need to know. Do you like cupcakes? I've got enough for 8 of you. So just like Kerith Ravine, there you go. Zarephath was not in Zarephath was not in the promised land. Oh, stop it. Now you're just being pathetic. What, did they not feed you this morning? Okay. Listen up. So once again, Elijah is going to find himself in an unforeseen place. He's in Zarephath. Now, here's what you need to know about Zarephath, and Brad kind of pointed this out. Zarephath is literally Baal's home turf. This is his home stadium. And what we're going to find out is the drought is so severe that it's affecting even Baal's hometown. And so Elijah goes to Zarephath, and once again, he's going to be fed. But he's going to be fed in a kind of unforeseen way. In this story, he's going to be fed by a widow, a nameless widow in Zarephath. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I've directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. Oh, sorry, that was a horrible toss. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread. I only have a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home to make a meal for myself and my son so that we may eat it and die. So you have this widow. Elijah asks this widow, can you give me a drink? Can you give me something to eat? And the widow says, I only have enough food left in my house for one meal. I'm going to make this meal for myself and my son, and after this meal, we're going to die because there's no water in the land, there's no food in the land. We are hopeless. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Now stop right there. This was the last food that the widow had. And here you have Elijah showing up at her front door, asking her to trust this foreign God, the God of Israel, to trust God enough to give Elijah her very last meal. How many of us would have that amount of faith? How many of us would be willing to do what this widow did? To give her last meal, to trust Elijah and to trust God enough to give her last meal to him. But she went and did exactly what he said. So there was food every day. Listen, there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord spoken of the Lord spoken by Elijah. Now think about this. Every single day this woman woke up, went to the cabinet, opened the door, time to make breakfast. every single day she was given a fresh reminder of God's provision in her life. Every day she was given a fresh reminder that God hadn't abandoned her as that jar was replenished every single day. Imagine what kind of change it would make in our lives if we had the eyes to see God's provision every morning we woke up and we saw how God was providing for us. We saw how God was loving us. Imagine how that would change our spirit of gratitude and thankfulness to God. But the story doesn't end there. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" This must have felt like a cruel joke. God's going to provide for our needs. He's going to provide for our food. He's going to do this amazing thing, and then he's going to take my son? I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. It's just wrong. Elijah says, "Give me your son." He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." There's something else you need to know about Baal. So Baal was the god of what? The storm, the rain. But Baal was also a fertility god, which meant that Baal was given, he was given the power of life and death. Baal was kind of responsible for the circle of life, so to speak, every year. And so what we see happening in this story is, once again, God is owning Baal in his own territory by raising this boy back to life, showing that God, the God of Israel, actually has power over life and death. And while God's own people were unwilling to acknowledge God, this unnamed widow, actually testifies in this last verse. She says, "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Now, if you haven't heard me say anything else this morning, I want you to tune in at this point, because there's really 2 things that I need you to know from this story. Just 2 things, really simple. The first thing is this: I want you to know that God is real. It's easy for us to read a story like this, the story of Elijah, and conclude that it really has nothing to do with us. I'm not a widow who lived in some dusty town thousands of years ago. I've never even had to bake myself my own bread, okay? I don't really identify with this story. I've never met a person who worships Baal. But on that point, I think you might actually be wrong. You're surrounded by Baal and prophets of Baal every day of your life. But we don't call these gods Baal today. We don't call them that. We call them things like technology or money or status or sex or sports. We call them all sorts of other names. Here's the thing, anything that you've come to place your hope in is capable of becoming a god to you. There's an easy way to identify potential false gods in your life. I want you to do a little mental exercise with me this morning. Everybody close your eyes. It's always a risky thing at the morning session. Close your eyes. Okay, I want you to, with your eyes closed, I want you to imagine your life as a house. It's a big, big house, lots of rooms. Imagine your life as a house. Now, in each room of the house, there is something, or maybe someone. Something that's really important to you, really meaningful to you. Something significant. Each room is a different thing. Maybe in one room, it's an instrument that you love to play. Maybe in another room, it's academics, school. Maybe in another room, it's relationships. There's a lot of different rooms. Now, with your eyes closed, now imagine Jesus by your side. Jesus is by your side, and you're showing Jesus through the rooms of your house. You're opening each door, showing him what's inside. Let me ask you a question. Are there any rooms of the house where there's a do not enter sign? Or a do not disturb sign? Are there any rooms of the house where you just say, Jesus, I love you and everything. You're the Lord of my life, but in this room, you're not allowed. In this room, I got to say no. You got to keep your distance. Are there any rooms of your house that you've locked Jesus out of? You can open your eyes now. If there's any room in the house that you've locked Jesus out of, what you've done is you've identified a potential false idol in your life. You've identified a false god in your life. And one of the things that the story of Elijah shows us over and over and over again is that these false gods, these false idols, these things that we give our hope to, these things that we give meaning to, will ultimately let us down. In Psalm 82, verse 5, it says, "The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk around in darkness." The Baals of our world, the Baals of our lives, are guaranteed at some point or another to let us down. Why? Because they're not real. They're not living. In Jeremiah 2:5, it says, of Israel, it says, they followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. There's this principle in Scripture. You need to know this principle. The principle of Scripture is you become like that which you worship. Whatever you have decided to dedicate your life to, your life will start to look more like that. So what Jeremiah says is, if you dedicate your life to things that are false, if you dedicate your life to false idols, false gods, your life will start to look as empty as those gods. You become like that which you worship. The switch that we're talking about today is to switch to trusting a God who is living and real, a God who is greater than our fears, greater than our sins, greater than our failures, greater than all of our false hopes. And if you find yourself wondering this week, I just don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical. I'm a little bit cynical. I don't know if I can trust that God is really real. Please talk to somebody this week. Come talk to me. This is what I love to do, okay? This is like my career. I love talking to people about why it's reasonable to believe in a God who is real. You're in the right place this week to start asking and answering some of those questions. The second thing that I want you to know is that you can also trust this God to provide. God is real and God provides. In the New Testament, the book of James, it says in James chapter 1 that every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Every good and perfect gift is from above. Our God is a God who provides. But I should warn you that our God doesn't provide in the same ways that Baal provides. The problem with all the Baals of the world is that those are microwave gods. They're gods of the moment. So if I want this over here, what I do is I go to the God of the moment, I go to the microwave God, and boom, I expect that right now, right here, exactly the way I want it. And sometimes we bring those expectations to God, right? I mean, one of the things is we all have these devices in our pockets, right? We all have these, well, many of us, we have these phones in our pockets, and this kind of conditions us. It conditions us to wanting everything immediately right now, just as I want it, just as I expect it. And we bring those expectations to God, and God doesn't provide for us in exactly the way that we want. We're like, what's the deal? God, are you even real? Do you even care about me? God doesn't provide for us in the way that Baal provides for us. That's what we see in the story of Elijah over and over and over and over and over again. God provides, but he provides in a way that suits the living God. He doesn't provide like the false gods. The provision of God requires our patience. It requires our faithfulness. And he may provide for us in ways that don't necessarily make us comfortable. And I know some of you in here this morning are skeptical. Maybe some of you can identify with the widow actually on this point. Something bad happens and you immediately start wondering, does God really care? Does God really provide for me? Is God just judging me for my sin? I'm not sure that I can really trust God in this moment. Trusting God becomes hard because you're just not really sure how it is that God could really love you. Some of you might be in that boat this morning. It reminds me of a conversation that happened in the New Testament. Jesus is he's having a conversation with a woman who's actually strikingly similar to the widow in this story. She's a Samaritan woman, and she's at a well drawing water in the middle of the day. The Samaritan woman is unnamed. She's an outcast, doesn't have a lot of hopes. Jesus encounters her and asks her for a drink. And she provides for him a drink, and Jesus says, "How would you like to have a drink so refreshing, so sustaining, that you never thirsted again? You never had any more thirst?" And what Jesus tells this woman, this Samaritan woman, is he says, "That's me. I have the ability to provide for you in ways that nothing else in this world can match. I have to offer you real life, real hope, not condemnation, but grace." And I hope I'm not stretching this, but I can't help but think of Jesus in the last words of Elijah. When Elijah comes downstairs and he presents the son back to his mother alive again, and he says, "Look, your son is alive." I didn't know if I was going to do this morning. This is my third week of move this summer. And like you've heard, it's been a little bit of a tough summer on all of us. Jace was a student of mine at Ozark. Fall semester last year, showed up 8 o'clock in the morning, Greek 1A, and saw Jace sitting there in the third row. And Jace was an amazing, amazing kid. And he was a great student and had a great heart for the Lord. And I can't help but think of Jace when I read this text. I can't help but think of Jace's parents when I read this text. You know why it's important, I think, for you guys to hear about Jace? Most of you, the overwhelming majority of you don't know him. But you know why it's important for you to hear about him? It's because Jace and the story of Jace really represents what this week is about. Because every person that's on this stage believes every single word that we are saying to you. And when you encounter loss in your life, when you encounter tragedy in your life, everything becomes so much clearer and so much more concrete. And I had this realization this summer as we were dealing with this tragedy and also dealing with the story of Elijah, that that the story of Jesus, the story of a God who gave his son to die, to be buried, and ultimately to be risen again, is a story that gives us all hope, real hope, hope that nothing in this world can provide, hope that certainly the Baals of this world can't provide. And it's a hope that Jace knew well. It's a hope that inspired him to go into ministry and tell other people about it. And it's a hope that inspires me to stand on this stage and talk to you this morning. We don't run away and cower in fear because of the realities of life and death. No, the realities of life and death send us running to the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the realest thing, the truest thing, the most meaningful thing in this world. And I pray that this week you would discover the truth of that story. The truth of a God who doesn't allow death to be the last word, but instead says, "Here, your son is back to you alive again." Guys, that's real hope. And that's a hope that the Baals of this world can never provide to you. I pray that here's my prayer for you this week, and I'm way over time. That's okay. My prayer for this week is that you would open your eyes. The book of Psalms says, "Be still and know that I am God." I know it's hard in weeks like this sometimes to be still. There's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of distraction. Guys, be still. And know that there is a God who is real, Know that there is a God who provides, and know that God wants you to be in exactly at this place, at this time, with these people. Be still and know that he is